paper trembled in the prisoner's hands, not from cold, but from disbelief. For months, he had stared at nothing but barbed wire, guard towers, and the dry dust of Texas wind. Then, without warning, an American sergeant placed a stack of lined paper and pencils on the table. The words were simple, spoken in halting Japanese. "You may write home." Silence filled the barrack. To men who had been taught that capture meant shame and erasure, the idea that letters could cross the ocean seemed as unreal as a dream. It began on a September morning in 1943 at Camp Kenedy, Texas. Roll call had just ended when Captain Richard Harris, a tall officer with a clipped Southern accent, addressed the assembled prisoners. He explained, through an interpreter, that the War Department had approved communication under the Geneva Convention. Each man would be allowed one letter per month, 24 lines, carefully censored, but genuine. Some prisoners stared in suspicion. Others lowered their eyes in silence. A few whispered that it must be a trap, a way to lure out secrets or expose relatives in Japan. Lieutenant Hiroshi Takeda, once a proud officer of the Imperial Army, clenched his fists behind his back. In Japan, the very act of being captured was considered dishonor. To admit his survival, let alone his captivity, was unthinkable. Yet the idea of reaching his wife and 2 children gnawed at him. Would she even dare to open such a letter, or would neighbors denounce her for receiving the words of a disgraced soldier? Takeda's diary later recorded a line that still survives. "We were told to die. Instead, we are told to write." When the guard unlocked the storeroom and carried in boxes of stationery, the sound of sliding pencils startled the prisoners more than rifles ever had. The room filled with a strange hesitation. Some men grabbed paper eagerly, scrawling characters as fast as their hands could move. Others pushed it away, afraid that any mark would betray them to shame. The barrack smelled of ink and dust, mingled with the silence of 100 unspoken words. Records from the camp show that in the first week alone, over 4,000 letters were collected and shipped through the Red Cross to neutral countries for delivery to Japan. The logistics themselves were staggering bags of mail, each weighing more than 30 kilograms, sorted and stamped with U.S. Army postal codes, for prisoners accustomed to ration slips and shortages. The sight of such abundance of paper and stamps was itself a revelation. Yet even as the first mailbags left the camp, unease lingered. What if the letters never reached Japan? What if they returned unopened, marked unknown or refused in the dim light of the barracks? One prisoner muttered to another, better never to write than to face silence. The canvas mailbags slumped heavily on the wooden floor, their khaki sides stamped with black U.S. Army ink. To the Japanese prisoners, they looked less like containers of mercy than instruments of deception. Men gathered in circles around the bags, whispering that nothing good could come from America. And yet the guards, indifferent and calm, began loading them onto trucks bound for the nearest railway. What stunned the prisoners most was not cruelty, but routine. For the Americans, sending enemy mail seemed as ordinary as shipping crates of wheat. To Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, the announcement spread like wildfire. Each man could post 1 letter a month, with responses expected from Japan. Officers clarified the restrictions: no military information, no political statements, no maps or codes, only family news, health, and personal sentiments. The idea was unthinkable to soldiers raised under the Imperial Army, where secrecy ruled every breath. Even speaking of home was seen as weakness. For Corporal Kenji Arai, who had left his mother in Hiroshima, the thought of writing "I am alive" felt like both salvation and betrayal. Imperial propaganda had drilled into them that Americans were barbarians who tortured captives. Yet here were guards handing out dictionaries, even suggesting how to phrase difficult kanji and Roman letters so censors could read them more easily. Private First Class Masato Yamamoto noted in his diary, "The devils supply us with pencils. They smile when we ask for more. How can this be for a man who had once watched comrades shout Tenno Heika Banzai before death?" The contrast was unbearable. Was this kindness, or something more dangerous, a dismantling of the very code that had defined their lives? The prisoners soon learned that every word would be read. Americans slit open envelopes, stamped them, and blacked out any hint of forbidden detail. Still, the letters remained personal. The War Department even arranged for translations when characters were smudged or unclear. By the end of 1943, quartermaster records indicate over 90,000 pieces of Japanese POW correspondence had left American soil. The sheer logistics required warehouses, trucks, and teams of clerks and industrial operation of communication for prisoners accustomed to scarcity. The scale was almost as shocking as the permission itself. Takeda, once too ashamed to touch a pencil, finally wrote, "I live, though I should not. The Americans feed us. Tell our children I think of them." Beside him. Arai hesitated for hours before writing only 2 lines to his mother. "Your son breathes still. Forgive me." Around them. The barracks buzzed with scratching pens, men pouring fragments of themselves onto fragile sheets. For the first time, the noise of war was replaced by the hum of writing. Yet doubt did not vanish. Some whispered that the letters would never reach Japan, that Americans would twist their words into propaganda. Others feared their families would suffer punishment for receiving them. One sergeant folded his letter and held it tightly for 3 days. Unable to release it into the mailbag, he told a fellow prisoner, "Paper may travel faster than bullets, but it wounds deeper if it betrays." The first letters returned months later, carried by neutral intermediaries through Switzerland and the International Red Cross. A camp clerk read out names one by one, and trembling hands reached forward to claim envelopes sealed with Japanese stamps. The room, usually heavy with silence, erupted into whispers. Some men wept openly, others stared at the paper, too stunned to break the seal. It was the unthinkable proof their words had crossed the Pacific and come back alive. Before capture, Japanese soldiers had been taught that Americans desecrated prisoners, that no message could escape their cages. Yet here was undeniable evidence. Wives, mothers, and siblings had written back. "Your letter reached us." One note said, "We prayed every day for your safety." Another wrote, "The neighbors cannot know, but we hide your words inside the family altar." The contrast to Imperial propaganda was devastating. Sergeant Takeda, who had once scoffed at the possibility of writing, sat motionless as his wife's shaky handwriting confirmed she had received his message. For him, ideology cracked not in a battlefield explosion, but in the soft scratch of a pen. Even more shocking were the materials provided. Guards distributed not just paper, but small bilingual dictionaries, templates, and instructions on how to format dates in Western style, to men who had struggled with foreign alphabets. This seemed impossible generosity. Corporal Arai watched as an American sergeant patiently guided prisoners on how to write, "I am healthy" in simple English, so that Red Cross censors could process it faster. The enemy, he thought, teaches us to speak with our families. What kind of war is this? By mid-1944, Red Cross reports showed that over 250,000 Japanese POW letters had circulated through American camps. At Camp McCoy alone, records logged nearly 12,000 outgoing messages in a single quarter. Each was carefully checked, stamped, and dispatched to prisoners who remembered rationing ink in Japan. The scale of this system was unimaginable. One guard joked that their camp consumed more stationery in a month than some Japanese regiments carried into entire campaigns. The statement was not far from truth. Masato Yamamoto received a reply from his sister describing how their family had been displaced by bombings in Osaka. She urged him to survive, even if shame followed him. The letter shook him more than the sound of any artillery barrage. In private, he whispered to Takeda, if they lied about the enemy, what else did they lie about? The thought lingered like smoke in the barracks. For every prisoner clutching a letter, there were others who received none. Some families had been lost in the fire bombings. Others feared retribution and never answered. The silence was as loud as the replies. A young private, after weeks of waiting, tore up his blank paper and muttered, "Even ghosts cannot write back." Yet the very existence of correspondence, partial though it was, gnawed at the foundations of belief. The trucks rattled away from camp gates, piled high with mail sacks bulging like harvest baskets. To the guards, it was a logistical routine. To the prisoners, it was something closer to a miracle. Across the United States, from the rolling plains of Texas to the snowy forests of Minnesota, Japanese POW camps echoed with the scratching of pencils. By 1945, American quartermaster reports recorded a flood well over 500,000 letters exchanged between captives and their families. Each letter carried fragments of two worlds colliding. One prisoner in Camp Lordsburg wrote, "We eat bread every day. The Americans even give us milk. I am ashamed to write this, but it is truth." His words passed through censors, crossed neutral ports, and arrived in Yokohama, where his mother read them in disbelief under the dim light of kerosene lamps, for families enduring rationing and firebombs. The news that their sons lived and lived with such unexpected conditions was almost unbearable. Some kept the letters hidden in roof beams, fearing neighbors might report them to police. The scale of the correspondence demanded an industrial system. U.S. Army trucks carried mailbags to Chicago sorting centers, where clerks processed tens of thousands of foreign letters each week. Neutral carriers then forwarded them to Switzerland, which relayed them to Japan. A single mail convoy could weigh several tons, dwarfing the meager postal operation still functioning in war-torn Tokyo. For a prisoner accustomed to counting every grain of rice, the idea that the enemy devoted entire trains to moving their letters seemed incomprehensible. The replies cut deeper than the first permissions. R.I.'s mother wrote, "The garden is gone, burned. But we have your words. They feed us more than food." Another prisoner, Corporal Sato, received a letter stained with ink blots, where his wife confessed she had told neighbors he was dead to protect their children. "Do not return," she wrote. "They will despise you." Reading such lines in a barrack filled with whispers of joy and despair was like being struck twice, once by survival, and again by rejection. The letters themselves became contraband within contraband. Men traded glimpses of handwriting, clung to envelopes, read and reread every line until the paper wore thin. One guard noted in his report that prisoners sometimes lined up simply to watch mailbags being loaded, as if the sight itself carried reassurance. It was not sentimentality, it was evidence. Physical proof that their voices had crossed oceans and come back. What unsettled them most was not just that the letters traveled, but that the Americans wanted them to. Why would a nation at war spend fuel, paper, and manpower to maintain the humanity of its enemies, to men indoctrinated in sacrifice? It was a question with no logical answer. In his diary, Lieutenant Takeda wrote, "We are defeated not by their weapons, but by their indifference to hatred." The barracks grew quieter at night. Once, they had echoed with chants, songs of loyalty, or whispered recitations of the Emperor's orders. Now, the sound was the rustle of paper, the murmured reading of replies from Japan. The letters, meant to reassure, instead carried a deeper wound, proof that the Empire's words did not match reality. At Camp McCoy, Sergeant Takeda reread his wife's trembling lines. "We feared you dead. They told us none would be taken prisoner. Yet here are your words." Each syllable pierced his training. How could an empire that commanded men to die admit no place for survival to live was already betrayal? Yet, to receive a reply meant his family still prayed for him. The contradiction was unbearable. Masato Yamamoto confessed in his diary, "Every envelope is a blade. It cuts away what we believed." Not all prisoners embraced the letters. Some tore them apart, unwilling to face families who still suffered while they lived with bread and milk. Others clung to them obsessively, as if a single page anchored them to life. A young private, Shunji Nakamura, carried his mother's letter folded against his chest until it disintegrated. When asked why, he whispered, "This paper is heavier than the rifle I carried." By late 1944, U.S. records indicate that Japanese POWs had exchanged nearly 800,000 letters with families. Each line was weighed against censorship, but still, the flow was unstoppable. The numbers dwarfed expectations so vast that warehouses in Chicago stored enemy mail in the same rows as American soldiers' letters from Normandy and Saipan. One American clerk joked, "We ship more paper to Japan than bullets, to prisoners." The scale confirmed a terrifying truth. A nation so abundant it could spare resources even for its captives was unlike anything their leaders had described. In the camps, cracks opened between men, the diehards, still loyal to imperial dogma, accused letter writers of weakness, of poisoning morale. Others argued that family was the only thread left. Arai confronted a fellow prisoner who spat on his letter, saying, "Better to burn it than to read lies." Arai replied simply, "If my mother's hand wrote it, then it is truth." The conflict did not end with words. Fistfights broke out, dividing barracks into those clinging to ideology and those yielding to reality. Takeda, once the proudest officer, wrote in his diary, "The Empire commanded us to fight to the last man. Yet, in America, they send us to write to the last word." The lines circulated secretly among prisoners, copied into notebooks, whispered in bunks. It was more dangerous than any weapon and idea spreading in silence. The war's end drew near. Though behind barbed wire, the prisoners learned of it only in fragment snippets of radio broadcasts, guards' casual conversations, a sudden increase in mailbags heavy with final replies. By August 1945, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, silence fell in the camps like a second detonation. Then came the announcement Japan had surrendered. The men who had once written in shame now faced the reality that their nation no longer existed as they had known it. For many, the letters became fragile bridges between two collapsing worlds. Families wrote of burned cities, rationed rice, and lives carried on in absence. A widow in Tokyo received her husband's letter weeks after learning he had died in captivity, holding the paper as though time itself could be reversed. Another family in Fukuoka read their son's words describing milk and bread in America, then compared it to their own starvation under scorched skies. These contradictions, carried across oceans, began to erode the mythology of imperial invincibility long before repatriation ships sailed. The logistics had been staggering. More than 1 million letters exchanged between Japanese prisoners and families during the war, each vetted, stamped, and ferried by networks of trains, ships, and neutral intermediaries. The figures alone told a story of industrial abundance. A single U.S. postal center in Chicago processed more enemy mail in a month than all of wartime Tokyo could manage in a season. For prisoners, the fact that their captors could casually devote such resources to human connection, even as battles raged, remained the ultimate contradiction. Sergeant Takeda, broken of his old certainties, read his final reply from home aloud to Yamamoto. "The children wait. Come back. Even in shame, life is greater than death." Tears fell silently onto the paper, each drop dissolving a fragment of the creed he once carried. Around him, prisoners compared letters, clutched envelopes, or stared blankly at words they could not bear to read. For some, the letters planted seeds of hope. For others, they deepened despair. Yet none could deny that the act of writing had transformed them. When the final mailbags left Camp Kenedy in October 1945, bound for a defeated Japan, the guards treated the load with the same routine efficiency. To the prisoners, it was more than mail. It was the last trace of a voice carried across war. Watching the trucks depart, Takeda whispered, "We entered as soldiers. We leave as letters."